Aloha everyone, it's Ajanette and I am here to do part two of your week one personality lecture. We're going to start by reviewing some of the historical perspectives that help to try to understand and explain personality, starting with Hippocrates, who was, as you may know, a famous philosopher. And although it might seem a little absurd and bizarre, he actually suggested that personality was tied to biological fluids. And interestingly enough, um, you know, I think it's really insightful because it was years later that we discovered that there is likely a biological basis of personality, but it's genetic and DNA rather than connected to our bodily fluids. The bodily fluids that he was focused on were yellow bile from the liver, black bile from the kidneys, and blood from the heart, and then finally phlegm from the lungs. And as I'm talking to you today, and my lungs aren't feeling that great, and my voice isn't feeling great, I definitely relate to the phlegmatic temperament today. You might hear it in my voice a little bit. Oops, let me. And so Galen came along and he actually expanded on this notion from Hippocrates and suggested that there's specific traits associated with each of the personality types that are connected to those bodily fluids. And so a choleric person is passionate, ambitious, and bold. A melancholic person has a degree of reservation, anxiety, and unhappiness. A sanguine person is joyful, eager, and optimistic, and a phlegmatic person might be calm, reliable, and thoughtful. And then Gall kind of took it a different direction. Gall actually suggested that you could observe and measure personality based upon the bumps on one's head and measuring the distance between those bumps, and that could help you identify personality. So, for me, this actually is problematic because I have a really bumpy head, and so I don't know what that means. It certainly means that I won't look good bald, and my granny did go bald, so I don't have great things to look forward to. But I don't necessarily know that that's reflective of my personality, right? So I wouldn't go around measuring the bumps on my head to assess my personality, nor would I recommend you do it as well. In fact, this is probably one of the early examples of pseudoscience or false science that we find in psychology. So the study of your bumpiness on your head phrenology actually doesn't have any research support, and there's no connection between personality and bumps on your head. So if you have a flat spot on the back of your head, it may not indicate your personality is any particular way, but it might indicate your mom left you flat in the crib quite often when you were younger. Kent and Wundt also kind of expanded. Kent really took those traits and expanded them even further beyond those few that we just discussed. And then Wundt organized them along two spectrums, specifically kind of the strength of one's emotions, and then secondly, how flexible or adaptive they are with their temperaments, right? And that new organization really kind of laid the groundwork for some of the the personality theories that we'll discuss in this course, because we do categorize personality different theories along different continuums or spectrums, or they have different underlying driving forces that they may base their categorization on and their descriptors on. But still, the basic general notion very much did kind of pave the way for many theories that we consider today. Now, as you've heard, Freud was one of the most prominent and influential theorists, specifically as it relates to personality. Other areas too, development, clinical psych. So he actually kind of spills over into many of the branches that we talked about. And as we have discussed, Freud really felt like the driving force of your personality is unconscious. So this was very much a deterministic perspective that suggested that forces outside of your conscious control are going to be driving your development and your personality that results from that development, right? He broke personality into three separate components, your id, ego, and superego. I like to think of the id as the little devil on my shoulder, more of the primal urges, the instincts, right? The anger, kind of the raw emotions, right? Then there's the superego, which is your little angel on your shoulder, helps to balance. That's the morality, that's the rule follower, that's the right and wrong. And then the ego helps to be that balance, that moderation. We don't want to go on the extreme and just be primal and, act on all of our urges. And then we also don't want to be so rigid and demanding and squares that we don't have any opportunity to really enjoy life. And so the id might say, "Ooh, I want that," right? Take it. And the superego would be like, "Oh, that's highly inappropriate." And the ego is somewhere in the middle. And so I think it's important to consider the underlying concept of balance in Freud's theory. I really do appreciate that. And we definitely know that, in moderation, anything is kind of allowable, and specifically like if we're talking about nutrition or something like that, right? Like, I don't want to cut chocolate out entirely, but in moderation. And so I think Freud's theory does have some really good points, but the sexual undertones and that psychosexual development, that is really where we became a little bit off base. And he suggested that those are huge when those oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital stages, when the needs aren't met, then we can become fixated. And that becomes problematic because then that can be repressed into our unconscious and it can shape pathological personality development. We become fixated. And so that is a challenge, right? Um, Beyond Freud, here's a really great video that takes you through some of the other perspectives. I'm not going to actually play the video within my video, so I'm going to encourage you to stop my video and play this video. Incorporate that into your reading and lecture notes, of course. And this gives you, like, in 4 minutes, it gives you just a general kind of basic components of each of the different perspectives. And then throughout the course, we'll dive into these different perspectives in greater detail and talk about specific mechanisms by which they might shape your personality development. So I'm going to move on and go into Kellen's work. And so with Kellen, you're going to read a chunk of chapter 1, not the entire chapter. We're going to cover the second part of the chapter in the research methodology unit next week. But for this week, focus on the first part of the chapter, pages 1 through 12. Again, in the slide, it links you directly to your reading. You'll also find those links directly in the course management tool as well. So in Kellen's book, we move into some different definitions of personality beyond on those that we discussed from the OER module, including Alport's definition. What I love about this definition is it's focusing on the dynamic nature of personality development and maybe the fluidity, right? Because I feel like I've evolved and changed over time. My personality is not the same now at 52 as it was in my 40s or as it was in my 30s, and certainly not as it was in my teens, right? I've matured, I've changed, lived experiences have influenced me. I've become a mother, so different roles and responsibilities have influenced me. And so, what I really love is this is focusing on the dynamic organization, how there are a number of factors, and there's this complex integration of factors that really shape our characteristics and our personalities overall. Now, Millen also highlights that complexity. And so for this particular definition, I like the fact that he does talk about it's deeply embedded. He focuses more on the unconscious, which I don't totally love. Like, I'm a humanistic perspective, and I believe that I'm in control of my destiny. I choose how I'm going to respond to a situation. I choose how I'm going to respond to my emotions and to my experiences. So I'm very much a humanistic person. And I kind of move away from theories that explain things as being deterministic and outside of us and our control. I like feeling like I'm in control of my life. Now, mind you, I'm very cognizant of the fact that we can't control everything, but we can control how we emotionally respond to it. We can control our thought processes around it. So I like to reframe things for myself, for students. I like to consider the value that a particular situation outside of my control might actually offer my growth opportunity, right? Like, what are the lessons I can pull away from that situation or that relationship or that lost opportunity? Um, and and Millen kind of takes an opposite approach to my approach, and he really talks about kind of it's ingrained in us and it's unconscious, and so it's not something that we have control over. Complex, yes, but not something that is going to evolve and change based upon our conscious, intentional reflection of our experiences in life and the lessons that may exist. There's when we talk about different ways that we study personality, you can take a nomothetic perspective or an idiographic perspective, one where you're looking at personality as an abstract construct, like love. We don't really know what love is, so we have to operationalize that as researchers. We have to say, well, how can we see love? How can we observe love? How is love expressed and experienced? And so that's what we do with abstract concepts. And so this perspective views personality as somewhat abstract, right? And so what it's trying to do, it's trying to develop a set of rules, guidelines, patterns by which we can observe and measure personality. From a scientific standpoint, we would call that operationalize. It's trying to operationalize the specific criteria by which we can observe and measure personality. And the problem with that is it kind of makes assumptions that these measurable traits and qualities can be observed in every personality, which moves away from this idea that personality is distinct and unique, and no one has a personality quite like you. It also kind of simplifies personality and doesn't consider the complex, dynamic, interactive nature of personality. An idiographic perspective kind of narrows in the focus, and it does very much look at the uniqueness. So their methodology is kind of focusing on individuality and not looking at common traits and patterns and categories that they would be able to group us into, right? So the problem is one is very narrow and doesn't allow us to have a more generalized understanding or to draw generalized conclusions. And then the other one is much too broad and simplified and doesn't allow for that individual nature. And to be quite honest with you, as a psychologist, typically we take an eclectic or interactive approach where we draw value from each of the different perspectives, each of the different theories, each of the different approaches. Even as a researcher, we use different methodology. So we never just kind of focus on one lens. We analyze the situation from multiple lenses. And it also helps when you bring a diverse team of professionals and researchers together because they might all bring different expertise and specialty areas. And so collectively, they can allow for a broader, more diverse and inclusive analysis of personality. So going back to Freud, of course, Kellen's going to address Freud too, because Freud is one of the most influential theorists. And in terms of psychoanalytic factors, if you watch that video, it kind of highlighted some of these as well, where it really talks about this notion of an abstract, unconscious psyche, and that personality psyche is composed of that id, ego, and superego that we talked about. He also talked about these different levels of consciousness, the unconscious over which we have no kind of awareness, the subconscious or preconscious, where we might have, a little bit of awareness with just a little bit of prompting. Like, for instance, you might be really irritable and you're just kind of being cranky and kind of bitchy. And then someone sits you down and says, hey, I noticed that you're being very reactive. Can can we talk about maybe what might be triggering you? And then you're like, oh yeah, I did have this conversation, or this situation is really eating on me. Or, you know, for me most recently, like my my oncology surgeon brought up the fact that she's uncomfortable with kind of the way my breast feels. And so I like instantly drive right into my paranoia over my breast cancer returning. And so consequently, you know, it's impacting kind of like my mood, how I'm interpreting things. And although I'm not consciously thinking about its effect on me, it is affecting me, right? So that pre-conscious can, with a little bit of prompting, like my daughter might say, hey mom, do you think maybe you're feeling that way or responding that way because of what's going on with your follow-up ultrasound, that kind of stuff, right? And then your conscious is, of course, what you have full awareness over. And that unconscious plays a very significant role in shaping your personality and your functioning, including your pathological functioning. And the problem that I have with Freud's theory is there's very little opportunity to change that, to correct pathologies, to address pathologies, to you're fixated, you're stuck. I interpret his notion of fixation as your fact, you know? And I don't like that notion. Again, it's that very deterministic perspective. And I really do lean into this idea that I can reflect on my traumas, I can reflect on my challenges, I can see how they may have hurt me and limited me in some ways, but then I can also very thoughtfully and intentionally reframe those things in a way that allows me to not have them limit me or not have them hinder me or scar me, but rather I can say, what is the growth opportunity? So we talk a lot about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but we don't talk enough about post-traumatic growth, where we use traumas to inspire us as an epiphany, to learn and grow and shape us in new ways, where we now are inspired to make a difference in the world and address that issue. And so that's just one example of some struggles that I have with Freud. The sexual undertones are also problematic. And it's not just for me, right? Like Alfred Adler, Jung, Erikson, because of these components of his theory that didn't sit well with people, they developed their own theory. So in that way, even the negative aspects of his theory were valuable to the field because they inspired other theorists, right? But one of those perspectives is the psychodynamic perspective, where, like Freud, they really believe in the significance of the unconscious. They believe that those early childhood experiences are instrumental at shaping your personality, but they don't have the same sexual undertones. They don't focus as much as those sexual driving forces in your personality. And they look more at the experiences that you have, the lived experiences, including those social and cultural experiences. So a little bit more, um, socially acceptable, tolerable. Learning and cognitive theories, as you saw in that quick little 4-minute video, they really focus on the nurture element of the debate in psychology. They focus on environmental influences. And so there's different types of learning theories. Classical conditioning, which looks at the association of stimulus and response. So for my daughter, she had some really negative experiences with her dad, and so that shaped her personality. She's a really strong, devout feminist. She also has a little bit of anger toward men, and hopefully that's something that she works through, right? But she has associated, men with these poor behaviors, and so she has a response to all men that's similar to that which she had toward her dad, right? Operant conditioning is about punishment and reinforcement that is either going to increase particular behaviors, traits, viewpoints, or, which is what reinforcement does, or punishment is going to decrease particular behaviors, traits, right? So if I have a really happy and outgoing personality, but then I'm punished, I get in trouble from my mom for making a scene, or, in our culture, you're not supposed to draw attention to yourself. You're supposed to be humble. And so that shapes me, right? That punishes me when I do step out and I'm very kind of boastful and dynamic and I want to be the spotlight, right? Um, and then the humility is reinforced in the culture as well. And then social learning theory is modeling theory. So my personality is shaped and influenced by observing my mom's personality, my sister's personalities, right? So in this, if this were solely the case, pretty much in a family, like we would have very similar personalities, and that's not necessarily the case. So this might explain one component of our development and our personality, but it's certainly not a comprehensive explanation at all. Biological factors, there's a ton of research, and neuroscience is producing new brain research every single day. The Human Genome Project has really done a deep dive in examining the chromosomes, and most certainly it's identified the link between specific genes and personality. But the more we learn, the more we realize there's more to learn, if that makes sense. Uh, DNA is incredibly complex, and there's these interactive genetic influences. There's also brain structures, right? Like your frontal lobe is typically associated with your personality. I remember my dad had a meningioma in his right frontal lobe, thankfully, because your left frontal lobe also holds some language centers. And that right frontal lobe definitely what impacted his personality. So as the tumor grew, it compressed his frontal lobe. He actually became nicer. He was kind of a mean, angry man throughout much of my life, but he became nicer. And so, it was almost sad to see the tumor removed because he kind of returned back to being an ass a bit. So brain structures, hormone levels, we definitely see this as women, as our personalities might change a little bit. We might become more irritable or more emotional as our hormones are cycling and changing. Also, like when we're stressed and those cortisol levels are flowing through our bodies, that also impacts our personality. And then certainly the different neurotransmitters and the different levels and how those balance each other can impact our personalities. So I've already talked a little bit about behavioral genetics and how we've done these twin studies and adoption studies comparing how personalities may be similar or different based upon the level of genetic similarity. And we do have tremendous research to show the connection between personality and genes. We also have a connection between a temperament. So babies are born with a certain temperament. They can be easy, they can be difficult, they can be slow to warm. And interestingly enough, as you watch them grow and develop their own personality, that personality is often tied back to that temperament. So my oldest son was really just an easy baby, and he had this wonderful, sweet, kind temperament. And then as he got older, he continues to be just a really easygoing, approachable, open guy. Um, and then you look at sociobiologists and evolutionary psychologists that really look at how do we evolve as a species, or how do we change, how have we adapted certain behaviors and traits over time in order to contribute to our survival. And there's been psychological research examining like how forgiving we are, and how that might be specifically of fidelity, and how might that be related to the evolutionary value. For instance, women are more forgiving of sexual infidelity, but not as much of emotional infidelity. The sexual infidelity doesn't compromise their survival, but the emotional infidelity does, because they may leave you and become a partner and resource and support for the other person, right? Which now makes me vulnerable. Whereas men are more likely to forgive emotional infidelity and less likely to forgive sexual infidelity, because that sexual infidelity means that you could be getting pregnant by a male, another male, and that would jeopardize their survival of their genes and their DNA. So that's just another kind of specialty area that examines the influence of biology on our personalities and behaviors and traits as humans. Then there's also this concept of these drives that we have, right? We have these biological drives, including a sex drive, a hunger drive, a thirst drive. But we do, like, we're not bad or immoral people because, we have sexual desires or arousal or we're attracted to someone. That's a normal, instinctive biological drive, right? You also have these like unconscious psychosexual drives that really are part of that deterministic perspective that suggests that there's something outside of our direct control or awareness. Those impulses shape our personality and development versus the humanistic that really looks at a self actualization approach where I have free will, where I can become the greatest person I'm capable of being, where I strive to grow. And that serves as a motivating force for me that pushes me to continuously strive to be a better version of myself. And then there's an existential perspective that might suggest that we find happiness and meaning for things that are outside of ourselves, right? This is like a sense of purpose might drive us, right? Our sense of spiritual connections, something bigger than just us, might be a driving force for us. So kind of looking at a wider, broader meaning and purpose to shape us. And all of these different drives might explain personality development, psychological functioning differently. So the biological factors, I think we already mentioned that. I think that went backwards. So socio-cultural factors, socio focusing on those social influences, societal influences, how are we socialized, what are the implicit inherent messages that we receive from society through the media that we consume, through the laws, through the rules, through the social practices and traditions, and then our cultural factors, including our specific cultural heritage or ethnic heritage, the values that are explicitly and implicitly espoused, the traditions and the practices that we honor based upon kind of the rules and structures within those respective cultures. So when you talk about culture overall, it's really representing the entirety of what a group of people think and value and what they do as collective members of that particular society and that culture. And they have these implied agreements, right? They continue to participate and honor those traditions. So culture is something that's learned. Like for me, I am Native Hawaiian. I did not grow up in the Native Hawaiian culture. My grandmother was estranged from my mom at a very young age. And so sadly, we did not get the honor of learning the traditions, the practices, the values. So it's something I had to go back and study later in life. And that's, part of my current journey. And so culture is learned. And then it certainly differs across society. It the culture that you see prevalent in one society might differ distinctly from another particular society. So you have to be mindful of those variations, right? And how you how you're judging or perceiving the world. Sometimes we center our own culture and our own society as being normal, and then things outside of that are abnormal. That's what we call an ethnocentric perspective. And we have to be cautious about that, right? I'm also cautious about, we describe American culture as a melting pot. I don't like to consider it a melting pot because that kind of implies that my own individuality and my own culture and passions and loves have to melt in and we assimilate into American culture. And I really kind of subscribe to a concept where we should be able to maintain our own individual love and value and practices from our respective cultures, and then still on top of that develop the traditions and appreciations and value of some of the American ideologies as well. But it is important to note that we do recognize the significance of culture and personality. So I am, definitely a very empowered woman. I'm vocal. I'm an advocate, and that very much is largely influenced by the fact that I grew up in America. Had I grew up in another country, that may not be the case, right? And I have to be mindful of that as I come to Hawaii, and I have to be mindful that, I shouldn't always be the first to raise my hand and speak up. I take more of a sit back, observe, and listen approach because, first of all, that's what my aunties would expect of me. And second of all, because the cultural values are different than you might experience on the continent. So we do also have to be mindful that this ethnocentric perspective actually has contributed to our lack of diversity in our research, both in the teams that we have used. I think I've mentioned it's largely been driven by a very white male perspective, and we have not considered any other lens as we interpret data. Additionally, our samples themselves have not been representative. A lot of the research that we've gained has been on white males, both from a medical standpoint as well as a psychological standpoint. And it's really only in contemporary times that we've expanded to include more diverse samples. So that's really, really important that we take a culturally inclusive approach. And that's built into many of our professional ethics guidelines and standards now in personality psychology and in all the other fields as well. So speaking of this field, certainly when we talk about psychology overall, it started with a focus on experimental psychology. Wundt actually established the first school and discipline. And then you had the personality theorists such as Freud and Adler, who kind of really presented these new novel concepts and opened up new dialogues and ways of considering someone's psychological development and functioning overall. And then, of course, his personality theory, and then Freud developed a clinical theory as well. But sadly, Freud's perspective is very pathological. And again, his sample was a group of neurotic women. So he based his theory largely on a pathological sample, which is problematic. But in more recent times, there's been a shift and a focus on positive psychology. So we're not just looking at the deficits in personality or the fixation or the challenges or the way that traumas have impacted personality development, but rather looking at positive aspects of personality like resilience, happiness, joy, even spirituality and the benefits that spirituality might have in helping us overcome traumas. And so that kind of more positive focus comes out of the field of positive psychology. And it's something that researchers are considering more and more. So as you wrap up this particular week's work, make sure you're doing the reading from both the OER module, lesson 1, as well as the Kelland chapter 1, pages 1 through 12. Make sure you're watching both part 1 and part 2 of the lecture video. Do your reading and lecture notes, and then make sure you engage in your learning activity later in the month or later in the week, which is going to, have you reflect on maybe your own perspective and lens. And then, of course, this only has 1 week, and then we're going to close this module with a reflection as well, which will be due over the weekend. So thank you so much. I look forward to hearing your insights and really what you've taken away as valuable and what you might see as being directly applicable to you or aligning with your views. Thanks so much. I wish you much love and aloha in all you do this week. Bye-bye.